Welcome to Good Thinking Live. Welcome to the show. This is the show, Good Thinking Live. We're here a lot of Mondays, not every Monday, but a lot of Mondays right here on LinkedIn Live and on YouTube Live under my channel, Becky Saltzman, kind of a casual channel, but we're here each week, not each week, again, a lot of Mondays to take a little bit of time away from all the time we spend on what to think so we can improve how we think. And this is a conversation. So those of you regular good thinkers know, and to you new good thinkers, let us know who you are and where you're from in the chat, because the cool thing about this show is that people come from all over the world, and this diversity of perspectives and viewpoints creates a really enriching conversation that takes us away from some of the kind of typical conversations where we focus on what to think. So I'm going to welcome the first good thinker to the show, Ray. Welcome from Camp Hill, Pennsylvania. Welcome, Ray. An excellent thinker, excellent good thinker. So anyway, we're going to get started. While I'm asking questions, again, let us know who you are and where you're from in the chat. It also tells me, okay, it's working everywhere. And I don't think, I'm talking to the ether. And I'm going to welcome Ruth from Los Angeles. Welcome, Ruth, to Good Thinking. All right, we're going to start with the first question. Do you have a group of people who think like you, like an identity group that you're a part of? Let us know in the chat if you feel that, yeah, I have an identity group that I'm a part of. And if you want to share what that identity group is, that's up to you. But let us know. And I'm going to welcome some new good thinkers coming on. We've got Alan, welcome. Barkley from Washington, D.C. Abdurached in the house. Hey, welcome, welcome. Anita from Bulgaria, Eastern Europe, welcome. We have got Alan from Kansas City, Missouri. And we've got the first answer. And Abdurached knows that rubber chickens for great answers, great questions, even more importantly, and participation. So Abdurached says, no, I don't really have a group of people who think like me. Anyone else want to come out and say whether they have a group of people that think like you? Stephen says, greetings from the home of the second largest waterfall in the United States. Really? Is that Multnomah Falls? He always comes up with great trivia. I love it. Okay. On a scale of 1 to 5, how much do you value being around like-minded people? Like 1 might be, I don't value being around like-minded people at all, to 5, I really, really highly value being around like-minded people. That's the next question. So as sometimes we lag, or if you're not coming live and you're coming behind the live stream, feel free to answer, but definitely do, because we come back to the conversation even after the live stream is over. So Ray says, almost everyone in my analytics group has the same primary insight color, blue. So we do think alike. To the degree that insight color means that you think alike. That's interesting. I love it. Insight color. All right. Those tests that kind of show you what type of person you are, what type of thinker you are. All right. Hello, Salma. Welcome. All right. So there are a lot of controversial issues where you think that there's a right or a wrong answer. And I'm sure that you have things where you think, how can people even think like this? It's completely obvious what the right answer is, or the right way to think is. All right. So get that kind of in your mind. Maybe something like some issue. Just get it in your mind. You don't have to share the issue. Now, here's the question. Would you rather be correct, right? Find out through the data, through years, through history, whatever, to find out that you're right all alone now, but you're right, but you're alone now. Or would you rather be wrong with the crowd? So maybe you're thinking of a work situation. Maybe it's not safe to be an outlier. So you'd rather be wrong with the crowd, just blend in and move on up, or would you rather be right alone? Now, while you're thinking about answers to those questions, because this is setting the stage for what we're going to talk about today, let me look around at people who have shared what they feel about how important it is to be around like-minded people. So Anita says, I have allies in different groups I'm part of, however, not part of a group of people. Normally, I'm the one having a different opinion. Well, that's probably why you're here. Independent thinking is part of good thinking sometimes. All right. 4, being around people who think like me. That's realistic. I mean, people say, no, I want to be around people who are completely different. But you got to be honest. What's more comfortable? And then Barkley says, let's see, being around people who think like me, 4, thinking like people around me, 1. Okay, that's awesome. I love it. I love it. Keep the answers coming. Multnomah Falls is the second tallest waterfall in the United States. Willamette Falls is the second largest. Largest versus tallest. Okay, fun trivia. I love it. Okay, Abdraja says, I don't value alike thinking. I admire diverse thinking that challenge me. Okay, what about diverse thinking that doesn't challenge you? That's great. I'd rather be right on my own. Okay. Mohamedou says, choose to be right alone. Perfect. And I like being right alone. Daniel says, I like being right alone. It's interesting. I wonder how much the good thinkers kind of lean toward being right alone. How do you know if you're right alone? How do you know? What kind of information, what kind of measurement, what kind of judgment tools do you use? All right. When you're with a group where everyone agrees and you agree, you really agree, how do you know if you're right? And this gets back to, how do you know if you're right? What do you use to determine whether you're right? So Hussein says, this is a true answer. Both answers are hard to deal with, but depend on the situation. And that's probably true. Like at work, you may have a little small issue where you're like, it's not that important. I'm going to let that go. I don't need to be right about every little thing. So that gets a rubber chicken because that's a nuanced answer. I love all the answers. Don't get me wrong. I love all the answers, but it's probably true that sometimes you don't have to, stand on everything, right? All right. So Alan says, I am comfortable to be surrounded by like-minded people when they see challenges as something motivational and instead of something deceptional. Fantastic. Abduracha, choose to be wrong in the crowd only if there is a feedback that helps me improve. Excellent. Another nuanced answer. More rubber chickens coming at every answer right now. I'm going to get out the 2 rubber chickens. We might have a lot of rubber chickens today. Okay. So Abduracha says you use debates to see if you're right. I love that. Because I can see the different. Okay. Daniel says I can see the different. Okay. That means I do something right. And sometimes it's hard with the chats, but these are great. Keep them coming, keep them coming, keep them coming. Okay. So today's good thinking conversation will revolve around how thinking about these differences between cognitive, implicit, and statistical bias can help you think differently about these questions. And that's really what today's topic is, but it's good to kind of frame yourself on how you're thinking in the beginning so that we can think about our thinking and think if we come out thinking differently. All right. So let's go back in time to when the term cognitive biases and the concept of this was first kind of coined. What year do you think this concept was coined? What year? Rubber chickens, all the rubber chickens for someone who doesn't look it up, but who gets the answer right. Even like the right decade. That gives you a hint. What year? The right century. That'll be a little red herring. What year do you think the term cognitive biases was coined? All right. So there's quite a simple way to estimate whether you're right or wrong. If it is morally appropriate and supported by data and facts. When it's easy to define, there is a right and a wrong. Okay. So moral intuition can be a little tricky. I love that. But I'm going to talk, and maybe we'll do an episode on moral intuition because moral intuition is a little trickier than I think people think. But I love that. Okay, so Abduracha says Francis Bacon. He didn't coin the term. Maybe the concept of it, kind of the idea of it, the kind of thinking that allowed the term to be coined, but he didn't coin the term. 2023. No. Much earlier. We've got someone in the right decade, and we have got someone very, very close. Very, very close. Probably, you can even say the right answer because like the day that they probably didn't document it, the day they didn't know when they coined the term, when Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky coined the term in 1970, 2, 3, 4, right around there, they probably didn't think, oh, this is the day we're coining this term that's going to become famous. All right. And Santucci says 1923. So it wasn't quite that long ago, but it was long ago. 1984, Daniel says. Okay. So and we know it was in the early 70s. Okay. This is what we know. So this is when Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, and Daniel Kahneman went on to win the Nobel Prize in behavioral economics, kind of the grandfather or the father of behavioral economics. I think he won the Nobel Prize in 2002. Amos Tversky was dead. You can't win the Nobel Prize posthumously, so it was just given to Daniel Kahneman. But their work was used where they used the term cognitive biases to describe our flawed patterns of thinking. And it's not just our flawed patterns of thinking. That's where it gets tricky. Cognitive biases. Are cognitive biases all bad or all good? Are cognitive biases all bad? Let's just do it that way. Put in the chat. Are cognitive biases all bad? Well, these patterns, they're predictable. That's what's cool about them. You can say, okay, there's the confirmation bias, where we readily accept and search for evidence that supports what we believe in the past, and we kind of dismiss evidence that contradicts our pre-existing beliefs. Okay, so that's we know that these patterns are predictable, but are they all bad? No, they're not all bad. They can help us make sense of the world. Like if you see someone sneering, you see a sneering expression like, and you immediately, your mind, even before you even are able to articulate it, your brain might register that as being mad. Or maybe there's a nuance. Maybe they're raging. I mean, you can see the difference. They help us make sense of the world. These are what cognitive biases do. Or you see tears and you think that person, depending on what else you see, quickly your brain registers, oh, they're laughing with tears of joy or tears of sadness. So although we may realize that we recognize anger or sadness or happiness, we don't really choose to recognize these things. Our brains do this unconsciously, implicitly. So people who are unable to make these fast thinking assumptions are often viewed as having a neural processing challenge. So it's such an important part of our brains. All right, so detecting them help us evaluate the quality of information we produce or receive. Okay, no, they're not all bad. Exactly. After Rachid says, no, all bad. Thinking Fast and Slow, good book. Okay, I'm going to say absolutely so much of the work. That's Daniel Kahneman's book that came out that kind of supports a lot of his research with Amos Tversky and others. All right, so these biases help us, but they're also traps that lead us away from wise decisions. And we could spend dozens of episodes on good thinking on these things. Let us, in the chat say, hey, want more on cognitive biases? Then dive deeper, because there's more to these cognitive biases than what even was revealed in Thinking Fast and Slow. As people working in all kinds of areas of perception are finding, as our tools of brain measurement are getting better and better. It's still not great. Okay, so we can identify cognitive biases are these systematic thought processes. They're a tendency of our brain to simplify information through this filter. And this filter is made up of personal experiences and preferences. So we can identify personal experiences. We can see personal experiences, but we can also hear, smell, and feel personal experiences, but the results aren't as obvious. Like we might not even have access to all of the personal experience receptors that are coming into our brains. What about preferences? Preferences is where things get tricky. And we're going to get into this so we can differentiate between cognitive, implicit, and statistical bias and give you some tools of thinking about this to become better thinkers. So where do preferences come from? Where do your preference, when I think of a preference, I think cinnamon. I love cinnamon. I really prefer the color orange to the color purple. Like totally, I see purple, I'm like, I see orange. Where do those come from? Well, at one level, we can talk about preferences coming from exposure. We tend to over-rely on our eyes. We over-rely on our eyes. Now, Santush says, I see some bias, same as illusion. We know it's an illusion, but still we see it. But a lot of biases we don't even see. I'm going to take this banner off so we have more room for our comments. There we go. Okay. Where do our preferences come from? So I like cinnamon, like I said. Well, it turns out that the mechanisms for how we develop preferences are fairly easy to explain when you look at society, sociology, topics like psychology. Our preferences come from systems of thinking, but the answer becomes far less accessible when we look deeper into our brains. This is where the things happen, and we don't necessarily know they're happening. We don't necessarily even know why they're happening. You can look at some psychology, you can look at some sociological explanations, and those are definitely explanations, but the closer and deeper that you look, down to the cellular level, things get a little bit trickier than what we think, because we have to use our pattern brain to answer those questions. So we have to probably answer these questions with measuring implements that are not our brains. So do you think that there is a link between the smell of disgust, disease avoidance mechanisms in our body, and prejudice? How many of you think that the smell of disgust is linked to disease prevention or disease avoidance mechanisms? And how many of you think that the smell of disgust is linked to prejudice? Well, it turns out that our sense of smell, our olfactory receptors, are responsible for many of our preferences without us even being aware. Recent studies show that our body odor disgust sensitivity, which is called BODS, BODS, body odor disgust sensitivity. Different people are sensitive to different kinds of body odors, but it's associated with explicit xenophobia and authoritarianism. Now, whether these studies are robust or not, whatever, but there is some initial studies about how our sense of certain sensory perceptions are related to preferences. And BODS is positively related to implicit bias toward an outgroup, suggesting that social attitudes may be linked to basic chemosensory processes. These attitudes were not influenced by background odors. So to date, most bias testing focuses on what we see with our eyes. Our ocular receptors, mine don't work so well. That's why I have these little things. Okay, so most testing is what we see with our eyes. There's some auditory. What about the role of olfaction in smelling or shaping our hidden preferences or biases? So given that our brains are now exposed to more information than ever before, but at the same time, we're now aware of our cognitive biases. We know that these biases exist. Now, you don't have to see them to know they exist. You have to just believe, you have to have faith that they exist, because you can't see them unless you create a measurement that accurately measures it and that you're showed, and we'll get into that. So just trust that they exist. They're patterns. Our brains are pattern-making, measuring implements. That's what they are. So given that our brains are more exposed to more information than ever before, and we're aware of these cognitive biases, are we more or less likely, like before the internet, to fall into cognitive bias traps? What do you think? More likely, less likely? More information, but we understand the processing mechanism a little bit better, at least intellectually. All right. What do you think? More or less likely? So that's cognitive biases. So we've got some other comments that we'll bring in, but I'm getting a little bit behind on some of the comments from both YouTube and LinkedIn. So we're going to jump into, now that we've done cognitive biases, which every bias, by the way, deals with cognition, right? So in some form or another. So all biases are cognitive biases. But when was the term implicit bias? When did that term get coined? And how do we think about it differently? Who wants to take a shot at when the term implicit bias was coined? Now we know 1972, right around there, we have cognitive bias in this concept. Okay, what about implicit bias? Anyone want to take a stab? Well, we're going to have to go back almost 30 years to 1995, when psychologists Banaji and Greenwald outlined a theory known as implicit bias. And this refers to how attitudes or stereotypes affect what we do or say without us being aware of it. Now, implicit biases include attitudes that form through experiences and operate outside of our awareness. So cognitive biases is probably, if you look at the foundation, that's everything in our cognition. Implicit bias kind of tends to be more about stereotypes and preferences, potentially. All right. So due to implicit bias, people often attribute certain qualities or characteristics to all members of a particular group, stereotyping or prejudice. which is weird because now that we're so kind of touting group identity is so important right now. It seems like the way to overcome implicit bias, if there is a way to overcome implicit bias, is to be able to look outside that identity of this individual. And yet, as we learn about implicit bias, we're also learning about how important identity. So it's kind of a conundrum for those of us who are thinking about our thinking. All right. So Santouche says, let's see what Santouche says. So psychologist, Mazarin Banaji and Anthony Greenwell first coined their phrase implicit bias in 1995. Right. Okay. So what we're trying to do, and we can look up stuff and put that in. Thanks for putting that in. But I'm trying to think, like, without looking at Google or looking it up, when do you think you first heard those terms? Because there's not like a right answer to look it up to get the right answer, but really, how do we think about, like, how long have these terms been around? So Kakila, hi all from Sri Lanka. Yay, glad to meet you. Welcome to Good Thinking. All right. So now, how many of you have taken the implicit association test, the IAT? That was the test that was developed to measure implicit bias. And it was based on the assumption that people should perform a task faster when concepts are associated in memory. Now, we don't know if we necessarily perform tasks faster when concepts are associated in memory. And we don't even know when concepts are associated with memory, how does that directly impact or relate to behavior? But we can make some assumptions about this. So it was all about the speed of association. So the test measures, and you can actually go take the test. I think you can just Google IAT or implicit association test, and you can take it for free online. I think it's through Harvard's site. All right. So it was all about the speed of association. Like they would have spider and scary versus spider and beautiful. And people would maybe associate faster spider and scary than they would spider and beautiful. And then they took people of different ethnic groups, different genders, and they would put, association. So they might say if someone was, white skin, they might say, okay, they make positive associations faster than they make negative adjective associations. And with black skin, they might say, or brown skin, they might say something different. So this was seen as a measure of your implicit bias. So what do you think? They took the words fast and slow, and they associated it with old people. What word, fast or slow, did people come up with to associate with old people? What word came up first? What do you think? And that was supposedly showed that you have an implicit bias toward old people. Like they came up with the word slow. Slow was faster than fast when associated with old people. And there was this famous implicit bias test involving Asian women and math tests. So there was a math test given to two groups of Asian women. And group A had their Asian identity highlighted or kind of framed. And group B had their identity as a woman kind of highlighted or framed. All right. So group B, group A, all Asian women. This group said, okay, really highlighted the fact you're Asian. That's your identity. This group really highlighted the fact that you're women. That's your identity. Which group did better on the math test? A, B, or C? No difference. A, the people who had their Asian identity highlighted. B, the people who had their female or women identity highlighted. Or C, didn't make any difference. Anyone want to take a stab at the answer? Let us know in the chat what you think. I'll take a sip of coffee while we wait. Okay. Anyone want to take a stab? So the stabs are going to come because there's always a delay. So I'm going to give you the answer, which is C. Okay, so we have C. No difference. Ooh, I love it. Well, it turns out it's A. The Asian women actually did better on the math test. The group that actually did better on the math test was the group who had the fact that they were Asian, their Asian identity highlighted versus their identity as a woman highlighted. There was a difference. So we can even have, you can extrapolate a lot from this, but there's a lot of evidence that shows us that if implicit bias is measured by the speed of association, that's how you want to measure it, that given that definition, we even have implicit bias toward ourselves. We even have implicit bias toward ourselves. So we've got another, oh, B. So it turns out A, no. When it was highlighted Asian. So this whole concept of implicit bias is based on association, which I say is impacted by the 3 E's. I call the 3 E's because I need little things like this to remember. Experiences, exposure, and education. 3 E's. Experiences, exposure, and education. And corporations have wisely started to do this training of these psychological biases. What is the goal if you take this? How many of you have taken bias training? We do bias training at Applied Curiosity Lab, and we have to do it a little differently now that we've dug into the data. What is the goal of hidden bias training? We do it in the framework of high stakes decisions, but a lot of people are doing this implicit bias training. What is the goal? To 1, A, acknowledge that it exists. B, to eliminate the bias that pops into our brains. Or C, to eliminate the bias behavior. What is the goal? How many of you have taken implicit or bias training? And when you take it, what do they state, or what do you feel is the goal? Is it to just acknowledge it exists? Is it just to see if you can stop it from popping into your brain? Or is it to change potentially biased behavior? Okay, so we can consider implicit bias is intrinsic or it gets developed by surrounding. Okay, excellent question. What about our intrinsic nature of our brain doesn't develop as a result of exposure? And that can be genetic, education, or experience. All right. So what is the goal? Abderrachid says A. Now, if the goal is to acknowledge the existence of these associations, the speed of associations, I think it's really good because how well do these tests measure actually the kinds of biases that we would like to eliminate is still a question. I want the answer to be clear that these tests measure the exact kind of biases that we want to eliminate, and by taking these tests in the training, we can eliminate those biases. But some studies have found very weak or inconsistent correlations between these scores and bias or discriminating behavior. So that becomes a little difficult. But there have been studies that show that this training does have an effect on, the makeup or diversity of an organization or a team. I'm not sure. I mean, you would have to change some policies. So there's kind of a mix up. Our brains do what our brains do. We should acknowledge that our brains do what our brains do. But sometimes brains are going to do what brains are going to do. And what we need to do is put in systems that work as brain bug workarounds. So at my company, Applied Curiosity Lab, we do cognitive bias training as part of our HSDM program, our high stakes decision-making program. Awareness matters. Awareness of the biases matter for sure. Awareness of implicit bias matters. But since these biases exist in our brain, we may not have as much control as we wish or as it seems. And if we focus on putting systems in place, that's how we can overcome these brain bugs, putting in these brain bug workarounds. But policies that rely too heavily on human judgment may not be the best for reducing the effects of bad biases, even the ones we're aware of. And we're going to jump over in the last few minutes to statistical bias, because this gets back to the initial question. If I'm around a lot of like-minded people who think like me, and I think I'm a good thinker, and we all agree, how do I know if it's the right answer? Now, there are a lot of situations where you're making a decision and you want a lot of variety. I think we should invest. I think we shouldn't invest. Or I think, we should hire this person for this reason. I think we should hire this person. We might want a diversity of suggestions, of perspectives, of judgments. But there are times where we want one right answer. Think about it. When you have, let's say, a suspicious mole on your skin, you don't want to go to a doctor on Tuesday and have that doctor say, not cancer. And then go Wednesday, maybe after lunch, and that same doctor says, oh, that's cancer. And you don't want to go to 5 different doctors and have, all different opinions. You want one right answer. But when you get different answers where you want one right answer, now remember, we don't always want one right answer. When you get different answers where you want one right answer, that's called noise. And that's another concept coined in 2021 by Daniel Kahneman and his team of researchers where they identified noise as variations where you don't want variations, different judgments where you don't want different judgments. All right. So biases make sense in our brains. And I tell you about that noise because this is how we're going to get into statistical bias for the last few minutes. We'll go a few minutes over just so we can wrap it all up. All right. So if your like-minded group agrees, whether you've had bias training or not, does this mean you've landed on the right decision or the right answer? Does agreement mean you've landed on the right answer? How many of you think yes or no? Put it in the chat. Okay. So in a situation where you want one right answer, like you want to know this is skin cancer or not, preferably you want to know not, does agreement mean you've landed on that right answer? Well, here's where statistical bias comes in. Because when you have agreement, it could be that you have the right answer, but it could all mean that you are all wrong together. Back to that initial question. And when you're all wrong together, that's statistical bias. So how do you know if you're seeing statistical bias? Well, think about your bathroom scale. Let's just say that one day you step on it and it says you weigh this, and the next day you step on it, it says you weigh that, and the next day you step on it, it says you weigh this, and the next day you step on it, it weighs that. That's variation where you don't want variation. But if every day you step on it and it says that you are 8 pounds heavier than you are on every other well-calibrated scale, that's statistical bias. So imagine you're shooting an arrow at a target, and you're shooting with a group of people, or you're shooting yourself. And every time you shoot, or every time the group shoots, here's the target, and the arrow lands here every single time. You could say, oh, that must be the target. That is statistical bias. When you hear statistical bias and cognitive bias and implicit bias, sometimes you hear the word bias, and you're talking about data, and you think, well, what are we talking about here? This is where it's very important to differentiate between cognitive bias, implicit bias, and statistical bias. This is a big topic. If you want to learn more, you can check out our LinkedIn learning course called Removing Noise and Bias from Strategic Decision Making. Okay? But all of this leads us, and we'll wrap it up because we've already gone 2 minutes over, and we'd like to end early, not late. Sorry about that. This leaves us with kind of a conundrum and an exciting opportunity. So these are the three kind of takeaways. We need to, one, acknowledge that our human brains are driven by forces that are not obvious to us. They're not even seeable to us. Our human brains are taking in information, not just from our eyes, even though we preference our eyes. Cognitive biases are the filters that help us make decisions in the face of lots of information. And that information needs to be processed. So this information is only getting more in quantity and probably less in quality. Number two, we have to accept the fact that stories from history and society and politics and psychology, they explain a lot. And these are important topics to study. But they don't tell the whole story about how we make decisions, who we like and dislike, and who we're comfortable with, who we fear, revere, idolize, and love. Because much of what drives our human behavior, including our biases, they're hidden from us. It's the stuff that goes on in our brains without us realizing it. They're implicit biases, hidden biases. And number three, we can't just rely on agreement to tell us what's right. We may all be in agreement about the wrong thing, or we may all be seeing the right answer, or we may be seeing the wrong answer hiding as statistical bias. The way that we can overcome these kinds of things is not by willing our brains to think better, but by understanding that these biases exist and putting systems in place as brain bug workarounds. And we could talk about brain bug workarounds if you share in the chat that you want to hear more about systematic brain bug workarounds. Then we'll put it in. So we're going to bring in some last minute things into the chat, and then I'm going to say hello and goodbye. So can we consider implicit bias as intrinsic, or does it get developed by surroundings? I think we've got that. That's a great question. Abdurrachid says A. Sorry, Abdurrachid, I didn't get to the A, so I'm not sure which one that is. Apologize. And then I've attended and majorly focused on our unconscious biases and self-realization. Excellent, excellent. So I'll be like to hear from you then, because if you've had a lot of this training, what kind of systems have you seen, or does this training rely on just forcing our brains to not see, hear, smell, experience what our brains have been trained through all kinds of ways to see, help, see, experience, prefer, whatever. What kind of systems have you seen that have worked? Have a great week. See you next week, right here, 9 a.m. Pacific time, 4 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time on LinkedIn Live and on YouTube Live. And you could subscribe by going to Becky Salzman and hitting that subscribe and clicking on that bell for notifications. And keep the comments coming. We'll try to get to all your comments later. Have a great day.